My name is Nancy Chinlund, and I'm an office chief in the Caltrans Division of Research and Innovation. I'm filling in for Alan Greenberg, who works for FHWA and was not able to be here today because of travel restrictions. So I did call, So I did call Alan to see what message he really wanted to convey to you all today. And he said he most wanted to emphasize the importance of research in demonstrating the benefits of shared mobility strategies. I think that's been discussed a lot today, so I won't go on about that. The key thing he wanted to emphasize was that when you can see benefits, then it encourages engagement, especially with public officials, encourages them to be more open to bringing some of these services into their communities. With Congress, it helps him to keep funding going for the value pricing pilot program. So I totally agree with Alan that that's very important, and it's been discussed today. The one thing I wanted to kind of emphasize was that it has to do with the stage of development of these services. Because there's been this explosion, and actually when I was thinking about these comments, I started to say there's been an explosion in shared mobility services, and I thought, well, that's overstating, you know. But so many people today have said there's been an explosion, so I'll go ahead and use that. It seems to me as that's happening and as these services are evolving, it's really important to be doing research and to be documenting what we're learning, what's working, what's not working. So that, and Susan does a great job of this, she's always done a great job of this, but that way we can really do robust development of services that will really be maximally effective. And if we don't do that research, then we'll just keep kind of wandering in the dark. So, so we have a terrific panel here today that will fill in a lot of the information about current research that's going on and the findings that they have. The first speaker will be Bodo Schwieger, who's from Germany. He's come all the way from Germany. He's the founder of Team Red and will be kind of focusing his discussion on the impacts of second-generation car sharing. Second speaker will be Nick Ramfos, who's the Director of Commuter Connections at the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments in the DC area. And he'll talk about the importance of evaluation and how they use the data that they collect to get their message out to their public, to their elected officials, and so that should be very interesting. Jennifer Dill is a professor at Portland State University, and she's the director of OTREC and the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, and she'll be talking about peer-to-peer car sharing. Elliott Martin and Susan Shaheen are going to share a slot. They're both with the Transportation Sustainability Research Center at UC Berkeley, and they'll be talking about the impacts of bike sharing and car sharing in North America. So it should be a very informative panel. This is going to be a little more traditional. We'll have each of the presenters come up and give their presentations, and if you would hold your questions to the end, then that's, we'll have a few minutes, hopefully, at the end for questions. So let's see, Bodo, you wanna?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me, Susan. I love to be here. Hello, everybody. I know you're all tired, so I put together 50 really interesting really interesting statistics. So 15 minutes on the impacts of second-generation car sharing, or how to measure that. It's a project by the city of Munich, so it's paid for by a municipality. That's very important, so I say that first. And they contracted us together with the University of Dresden in Germany and a marketing research company called Omnitrend. I'm with Team Red. Just a short introduction of myself. Who are we? Team Red is an innovation consultancy. We're now on the market for 11 years. We have 50 experts on board. We're working on mobility, transport, and tourism. And what we do, our core business is developing innovation, developing that into a market adequate service. So we are implementing it. We're never operating it. We're just helping others to get along, and we're evaluating it. So that's an important point. We do the evaluation as well, so because we know how to set up services, so we really know what to look into. That means we have a large number of different expertise in our company, which brought us in 11 years up to 10 innovation prizes. And here's some of the logos of our customers. We help setting up Car2Go, and we help setting up Volkswagen car sharing called Quickcar in Hanover. And that's probably the expertise which brought me here today. So let's have a look into Munich. Munich is in Germany, and Germany is in Europe. So I always experience when you're traveling in an American public transit, you have to explain where that is. So just so the size is 311 square kilometers, inhabitants 1.4 million inhabitants. It is a dense city, a large city. They have a really important airport in Germany. They have a really nice pedestrian area downtown. It's very dense, and they end up with a lot of traffic jams, basically. So they have very strict parking rules. In a lot of neighborhoods, you're only allowed to park when you are inhabitant there. When you live there and you own a car, then you're allowed to park there. Otherwise, it's very difficult to get access to these neighborhoods. The city is investing a lot of money in new mobility services, in mobility management. They have their own mobility management program, Gescheit Mobil, Clever Mobile. They have a very good communication strategy. You know, Munich is hosting the Oktoberfest. So if you want to come with me when I'm finished tomorrow, just it's a good time to go. The communication strategy is just taking up what the city is living for and living with. So you can see the bicycle strategy, communication strategy is based on these events. And now we see throughout the last years a lot of car-sharing companies going into Munich. The city is quite a rich city. Inhabitants are rather rich in comparison to other German cities, and so we count up to 7 car-sharing companies in the city. So you have, as a customer, you have a perfect choice of different business models. The city introduced a special parking regulation for car sharing. I'll be into that later on. And the idea now was to set up a project to measure the effects, which is just to compare the different car sharing systems. We have, that free-floating system. We have station-based systems. Systems that use private parking space and public parking space. So we have Drive Now and Car2Go in the city. Car2Go just started in June this year. Drive Now is 2 years in the city. They are free-floating and they use public parking space. Then we have 3 operators, or now 2. Zebra Mobile just shut down. We have Flingster and Citycar. They are using special licenses for parking in the neighborhoods. And then we have Stadtauto and Stadtteilauto. These are the original, traditional car-sharing companies, the one with the longest history, using private parking space, and they are station-based. Now, the city introduced parking licenses for this type of services. Zebra Mobile, Flingster, and Citycar. You can buy parking licenses for these cars for 1 out of 58 areas in Munich. So the operator is allowed to park the car in one of these areas, but the cars are not allowed to be parked in any other area. And that costs 240 euros per car per year. And now there's another parking license with the really cool name B, which means you can park the car all over the city in all of these 58 districts. But you have to pay for that, and that is 1,800 euros. That's roughly 2,400 US dollars per car per year. This is something you need to earn when you operate, and this, of course, has a high influence on the business case. So now that is the project scope. The city of Munich wants to know, is this idea good to provide parking licenses for these operators? That's to say, which effects of second-generation car-sharing services to the modal choice can be measured? And now this is the political part. If effects are positive in terms of emission, vehicle miles travel, car ownership, parking, the city will continue to provide parking licenses to car-sharing companies. That's the positive way to say it, or just vice versa. If these systems are not good for transportation system in Munich and they increase car travel, these licenses won't be available for the next years. So the business case wouldn't work then. So you can imagine that there's some political issue to this evaluation. Which are the data sources? We do have surveys. We're asking people, what are your means of transportation? What do you use? What's your current use? What is the availability? We're asking car-sharing users, and we are asking inhabitants. We're not yet registered. We compare demographics. We compare general attitudes. We do have access to the booking data of those operators. That is unique. So we are watching the people, how they're moving. We see the movement of the cars. We know the car types and their mileage. We see the users on this side, so within the system. And we see the rentals, so start, beginning times, positions. So we have a really good impression on the customer and on the vehicles. And all that is just to answer the final question, what are the substitutional effects by car sharing? I know you love this slide just by the first view of it, right? This is the timeline. Started in November last year, it's going into November 2014. We did desk research, search for available secondary data. We analyzed the backend data like I mentioned. We have a panel for new customers, which is very important that you're working with a panel, so you have the same people you accompany throughout time. So you're asking them today, and then you're asking them in a second wave within 1 or 2 years to see what changed in their behavior. That is really important. Then we have a control group, which are inhabitants of the city of Munich. And of course, we have a focus group to go into deeper details. Why do they behave like they do? And then we have additional expert interviews at the final stage of the project. We're now right in the middle here. And I don't mean that you need to learn this by heart, but the point is you need to think long term. If you're evaluating mobility services, you really need to think long term. It doesn't make sense to evaluate something if you just have 3 months to do it. You need to look now, and then you need to look a year later. What has changed? How did people change? A lot of behavior is learned behavior, and people need to learn and understand what the options are of new mobility services, and then they switch over, and that takes a lot of time. I understand that American economics are not always on the long-term focus, but in this case, it is really important to take the time. And it's complex. well, you see my slides, and I really simplified them. It is, you have to look into so many different effects. Just one example, we can discuss that later on. If I'm in time, you just remind me, okay. Yeah. We always talk about car sharing is replacing car ownership. Now, if you have 100 parking lots in one street, you take one car out and put a car sharing car in. Now, 10 people use that car sharing car, and they sell 9 cars. Then you end up with 9 open spaces. So other people who didn't own a car yet, because there was no parking space, say, oh, there's a parking lot. Okay, so now I'll buy a car. So you end up, again, with 100 cars in your street, with one car sharing car out of them, which is better used than all the other cars. But in the end, vehicle miles traveled are higher than before. So, does it make sense? Yes, you do. If you don't answer, I have to do that. So, there are models, or there are situations when even car sharing doesn't reduce car ownership. You need to reduce parking lots as well. So if you save 8 cars, you need to take out 8 parking lots. Otherwise, other effects are just filling out the gaps. So this is what I mean with complexity. You need to think in the system, not just within car sharing. Now some results. We're still working on that, so this is not the final result, just some figures to tell you where we are. We asked the inhabitants, do you know about car sharing services? And they said, 116 said, I don't have a driving license, so not an option. 246 said, out of 1,000. And 246 said, no, I'm not aware of car sharing. But 650 said, yes, I'm aware of car sharing. So that is something. 65% of the general people in Munich know about car sharing. And out of those 650, 580 say, I'm not a user, and 76 are using it. So almost 1%, which is a lot. 3 minutes. Okay, easy. I would say this is a success, that people know about car sharing and start thinking about it. This is a slide for all people who love statistics. For everyone else, this is just modern art. This shows how intense the vehicles are used by new customers. So this is the average. And people who come in, maybe in March 2013, they use the... Which one is it? Yeah, this one. They're using the cars above average, so very intense use. But the use is dropping. With these people who joined in March, they are traveling less in April and even less in May. So they try the system. They are curious. They want to know, how does it work? And then they say, okay, I cannot use it for this, I cannot use it for that, but I can use it for these trips. Or they get their first invoice. And they see, oh, right, okay, maybe I should reduce my use. So that's very interesting to see. There's new systems, they make people curious, they test it. That's different than we saw it in the station-based systems, where people started with a low usage and then use it more often than before. So, and finally, they end up all at the same level. That's very interesting, too. Okay. Now, how many cars does your household own, was one of the questions. The inhabitants answered that 86% of the households, they own a car. And out of those who just entered these services, for example, the second half of 2012, out of those who just became a new customer there, 70% of the households own a car. So, and before it was even 93% of the households. So that means we have households there, or we have a lot of households there who already own a car. So car sharing now becomes another option, secondary option. it doesn't mean that car sharing is an option for people who don't have a car. Of course, this is talking averages, but I think that's very important information to understand that car sharing becomes an additional option for a lot of people. So now, the very important question. Did you dispose of one or more cars in your household due to joining car sharing? I think this is one of the most interesting questions we have to car sharing. And we see that an average of 9% of the people who joined the new car sharing systems dropped one or more cars from their households. I think that's quite a good average, and this is what the city of Munich wants to read. Very interesting to see, and that's my last data here. The latest data we have from earlier this year, first half of 2013, it was only 5%, and it was 10% or 9% all the other months. So I guess, well, that's the question for the evaluation. We're asking a panel, so we will ask these people again in half a year or a year. And then the very interesting question will be, is this one rising to 9% as well? So do we have people who just sell the car right away when they join, and do we have people who change their behavior and go for the car sharing option and selling their car later on? So how fast do they adapt these new options? That's it from my side. Here information, I'm here, so if you have some more questions, just ask me, and we can send you additional information, updates on the evaluation if you want. So we are working on that for another year. Just keep in touch. Thank you.
Okay. All right, and Nick Ramfos.
As Nancy mentioned, I'm with the Council of Governments. We're the Regional Metropolitan Planning Organization in the Washington, D.C. region. And we're in a what's called a non-attainment region in terms of air quality. We've been designated by the US EPA, and our region had to basically come up with what are called transportation emission reduction measures. This is going back to the early 1990s to mid-1990s. And we encompass 11, the non-attainment area encompasses 11 jurisdictions. And we currently have about 2.7 million commuters in that non-attainment region. And so the purpose of what we call terms, transportation emission reduction measures, are to essentially reduce congestion, help reduce congestion, and improve air quality. So as part of that, our board, our Metropolitan Planning Organization, adopted these measures, and I kind of identify with a lot of the slow start frustration that some of the shared ride use services are experiencing today, because we had similar issues back then, because most of the money in the region was going towards road building. And the fact that our board was going to take several $1 million and shift it to transportation demand management wasn't a very popular idea. So we basically said, okay, fine, we're going to evaluate these programs, and we're going to set up some goals and set up some objectives in order to meet these air quality requirements for the region, so that our transportation dollars can flow for these road projects. So the first step was to develop a framework. It was very important. We weren't really sure because we didn't have the experience, so we basically made a lot of assumptions in terms of how we would get to those goals. And we had to be realistic as well, and so we didn't want to, I guess, overpromise and underdeliver, so we basically tried to set the goals where we thought we would be able to hit the mark in terms of meeting emission reductions as well as transportation impacts. And then I think a lot of folks say, yeah, that's great, you did evaluation, but then how do you communicate those benefits and impacts? And that was another challenge that we had down the road. Once we started getting a lot of the data in, we had to determine what's the best way to do that. So a framework is the roadmap. As I mentioned, we use it to determine those goals and objectives, and it is a document we update every 3 years. We don't just produce it and then just leave it on the shelf. We use it as a working document with all of our stakeholders. In that framework, there's a lot of data that's collected. We do a number of surveys. One is called the State of the Commute Survey. It's a triennial survey that we do to collect information on awareness and attitudes in the region on transportation demand management programs. We also do several surveys on telework. We've done a car sharing survey. We have had our department, our district department of transportation has also done a capital bike share survey. We have done surveys of our van pool operators. The survey I'm going to focus on today is our placement rate study, which is a survey of our ride-sharing applicants in our Commuter Connections program. It's a triennial survey. The last one we did was in December of 2011. We surveyed about 900 applicants from the database. We have about 30,000 applicants in our rideshare database. And these are individuals that applied anywhere from July through September of 2011. And some folks may ask, well, why that particular quarter? Well, back when we started this, we did quarterly surveys from 1997 to 1998, and then from 2000 and 2001, and we determined that the third quarter of the calendar year was probably the most representative of all 4 quarters in the year in terms of the results that we were getting. And then just to justify it, we did annual placement rate surveys in 2003, 4, 5, and then starting in 2005, we went to a 3-year process. Our next survey is due up in 2015. So again, we collect the data. We use it as part of our term analysis report, which then goes into our regional air quality conformity analysis, as well as into our congestion management process. These are 2 federally required initiatives that we have as part of the MPO process, and so we're able to contribute to both of those requirements. I think, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but communication is important. So up front, we needed to find out who our audience was, what was important to them, and we needed to team up with our stakeholders, including the folks that were a little skeptical on our programs and what our goals and objectives were going to be, to figure out what data points do we need in order to determine how viable the program was going to be. And so the types of data that we collect on the placement rate study includes the types of services received through Commuter Connections through our database. And it's not just ride sharing. We offer, we have a very comprehensive offering in terms of when you come onto the website, you can get information not only on the closest carpool or van pool to your work and home location, but we also provide the closest transit stop. We have all 11,000 transit stops in the region coded. We have all 350 park and ride lots coded. We have telework centers, both private and public sector, that are coded. We have a bike routing system. So there are all kinds of, these were added on as the program grew from the mid-1990s. So we basically ask, what did you get? How was that information accessed? And then what are your current commute patterns? Did those programs actually help you make any travel changes since you received these services? And then what were you doing previous to getting this information? And what motivated you to make the change? And so some of the use of services include, as I mentioned earlier, the carpool, van pool services, ride matching. We also have an informal rider bulletin board, so if you don't want to formally sign up for carpooling and set up an account, you basically can go right onto our bulletin board and just post the information that you're looking for and then connect with other individuals in the region. As I mentioned some of these others, park and ride lot locations. We provide van pool assistance through third-party van pool providers, and we also recently initiated a cash incentive program for carpoolers called Pool Rewards, and we've recently extended that to van pool operators in the region. We also provide all of the transit services, and then bike walk information, telework information. We also have a regional guaranteed ride home program that we operate, as well as special events. We coordinate a regional bike to work day event, as well as a car free day event, which we just held last month. So then, in terms of setting the goals, we wanted to basically determine the purpose of the program and what is its importance to the region. And so in setting up the goals, these are the goals just for our ride matching. We have goals for each of our emission reduction measures. So we have a regional goal for telework. We have a regional goal for our guaranteed ride home program. We have a regional goal for ride matching, which is this operations center, as well as an employer outreach initiative that we have to basically work with private sector and nonprofit employers to either start or expand programs at their work site. And then we also have a mass marketing initiative where we've set goals for that as well. So these are our regional goals in terms of how many total commuters we wanted to reach for 2011. What are the daily vehicle trips that were reduced, the daily vehicle miles of travel, NOx, VOC, and then we also collect information on greenhouse gas emissions. Even though there are no mandates in our region, we voluntarily just collect that information in the event that standards are ever set and we need to reach those goals. And these are our estimated impacts from the 2011 analysis. These are a little lower than what we typically would see, mainly due to the fact that we switched our ride matching system over in 2008. We went from a very intense hand-holding type of an operation to more of a customer service driven operation where it's all web driven and electronic driven. So there was a change there, and I think one of the things that we saw from that is that we had a lot of duplicate information in our previous database. So some things changed, and we're working to actually build up the program based on what we saw back in 2011. So what do we find out from these evaluation results? Well, the results can help strengthen your message because you get a lot of data that you could use. And so, for instance, as part of our mass marketing message, we're able to use this data to strengthen what we communicate to the public, to our stakeholders, to our elected officials, basically to anybody who's interested in hearing about what we have to offer. So what do we find out? Over half of the individuals that come to our service changed the way they traveled after receiving our services. About 12% tried carpooling. About 11% tried using the bus. And then about 8% tried commuter rail. And I'm not going to read the rest of these, but essentially these are the results based on what we saw from the survey. We also, so our permanent placement rate is 52%, almost 53%. But we have about another 17% who basically did temporary changes. This was an occasional change or a temporary change which lasted on average about 9 weeks, or a one-time change. So for instance, if somebody's car was in the shop, they used our service to basically connect with another individual to either carpool or maybe use public transportation. The other thing that we found out was about close to 40% of the respondents who made a change drove alone before starting their new mode. So they either drove alone to a rideshare arrangement or to transit or to telework. And then we also had a lot of inter-mode changes. So if somebody went from, let's say, a carpool to a van pool, or from a van pool to a carpool. They went from the bus to the train, or the train to the commuter rail, or from transit into ride-sharing, or from ride-sharing into transit. And what we call this is a VTR factor, which is a vehicle trip reduction factor. We basically use this factor as a multiplier to come up with what the actual placement rate impacts are. And I won't get into a lengthy discussion about that because we could probably be here the rest of the day to describe it. But we have it in a great publication that I can make available. It's right on our website. Anybody who's really interested in that, you can look through that. So finally, I'm going to talk about how do you communicate the benefits and the impacts. And I think the important thing is to make sure that you're collecting demographic information because that's really going to drive your message. Whether you're talking to your board, whether you're talking to the general public through a marketing message, or if you're talking to the media, whoever you're talking to, you really need to be able to communicate what these results are. So what we found is that, for instance, for our placement rate study, the majority of our respondents live in Virginia, but the majority work in the District of Columbia. And And I think primarily that's because we have a very extensive network of HOV lanes and now an express lane in Northern Virginia, and a very high concentration of van pullers and car pullers. Although Maryland is not too far behind, but there tends to be a lot more transit usage in the Maryland suburbs. 81% of the respondents work with employers who are over 100 employees. This is very helpful to us because we have an employer outreach initiative. So that basically tells us that we really need to be working with employers that have 100 or more employees, because that's where you're going to get the bigger bang for the buck. We won't turn away smaller employers, but I'll tell you that our employer outreach representatives are going to probably spend more time with the larger employers, because that's where we're going to see more of a bump in terms of impacts. Type of employer, no surprise here, federal agencies are going to make up the highest percentage. That's followed by the private sector and nonprofit, and then we have state and local governments. We also looked at ethnicity and gender distribution, and these are very similar. I included the 2005 and 2008 results. No huge changes here, but we do look at this when we're out purchasing media, and when we're looking at our media buys, we want to make sure that we're hitting the right audiences. And so when we do things like a PRISM analysis to find out who's actually talking to us and how do we communicate back out, we're using this information to basically make sure that we're reaching the correct audiences. And then we also look at age distribution in terms of who's using our services. About 80% of our applicants are between the ages of 35 to 64. Now, does this mean that we're not going to send a message out to those that are between 18 and 34, or anyone who's over 65? Probably not. We're probably going to reach some of that market, but we're going to really put the emphasis on where our largest target market is right now. So bottom line is that you want to identify your target audiences, which is what we do through this entire process. What are their information needs? And we have very specific goals, as I mentioned earlier. Our funding agencies, we have 3 state DOTs that we report to, and as you can imagine, they all have different agendas. We have over 30, and I just also want to say that our commuter set is much larger than just the 11 jurisdictions. We have commuters coming from as far away as West Virginia. We have commuters coming down from Pennsylvania. We have commuters coming from the Eastern Shore in Delaware. We have commuters coming up from Richmond, Virginia, into the district. And so we have a very broad coverage area, and our coverage area is much larger than the MPO coverage area in terms of who we're dealing with. And we have a lot of partners and stakeholders that are outside of our normal market. So we look at those network members and we ask them, what type of information do you need from us so that we can make your jobs a little bit easier? And then you want to tell your story, whether it's through paid advertising, through earned media, or through marketing initiatives. And then I think one of the things that we've really been very cognizant of is to be as accountable as possible, be as transparent. You need to present the good and the bad, and then make adjustments where necessary. And we've made adjustments to our programs based on a lot of the results that we've received back. And where something is not working, or if it needs to be tweaked, we need to come back and make those changes. And with that, I guess we'll be answering questions a little bit later, but thank you.
Thank you. So I know the style of this panel is a little different than we've had for the rest of today, but I understand we have a reception at 5 o'clock with a hosted bar, right?
Yes.
So you're going to earn your free booze by sitting through some more bar charts. So there you go. That's excellent. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to talk about peer-to-peer car sharing. Those of you who know the research that I do may have expected me to talk about bicycling, because I do a lot of bike research. But we're doing some peer-to-peer car sharing research in Portland, Oregon, that I'm going to tell you some very, very early insights from. So I actually have data, like the previous 2 speakers, and like everyone was asking for earlier today. So I'm excited to share some of that. So what am I going to share with you today? A little bit of background first. So The state of Oregon followed on the heels of California by passing some legislation in 2011 that dealt with the insurance issues with doing peer-to-peer car sharing. So that was passed in 2011, went into effect January 1st, 2012. And then soon after, Get Around started operating in the Portland area, offering a mechanism to allow peer-to-peer car sharing. Then also at that same time, Federal Highway Administration, through the value pricing program, which Alan Greenberg runs, which is why he would have been here, partly why, gave a grant to the City of Portland and the State of Oregon and Get Around, and then us, Portland State University and OTREC, to evaluate the effects of peer-to-peer car sharing. And the primary objectives, or our research question, is, can peer-to-peer car sharing reduce overall vehicle miles traveled, VMT, by marginalizing the cost of driving, while at the same time increasing access to jobs and other activities for those without cars? So embedded in that question are sort of two fundamental public policy objectives. One, reducing VMT, in particular peak period VMT, and that's Federal Highway's objective. The objective of sort of increasing mobility for people without cars, that was the City of Portland's objective. They were quite interested in peer-to-peer as a model for that. So what I'm going to share today is some early insights from that study from the vehicle owners. Okay, so the study, we are recruiting vehicle owners and renters into the study. We started with the owners. We're now doing the renters. So I don't have anything on the renters to share yet. But at this point in time, there are over 400 cars available through the Get Around system in the entire Portland region. Our study area is only the city of Portland. So the Portlandia, but not all of the city of Portland looks like Portlandia. We've recruited 335 of those vehicles, their owners really, into the study. And as being part of the study, your car gets equipped with a car kit that has GPS on it that records every trip, the start and the end, and some points in between. So we know the amount of that car is being driven, both by the owner and when it's rented out. We require, if you're part of the study, we have a pre-data collection phase. So before you can rent out your car, we collect that GPS data for at least 6 weeks or so. So we know something about your driving habits before you start renting it out. We also have you fill out a survey. We have interim surveys. We have final surveys. We have lots of surveys. And so what I'm able to share with you today are some results from 224 owners. So it's not our entire sample yet. So these were just the people that we had a pre-survey and the 6 weeks at least of the pre-GPS data. So that's one reason why it's early findings. And just to give you an idea, these people, in terms of over the roughly 16 months or so, some of these people have been in the study longer than others, but there's a big range of how often they're renting their cars out. Anywhere from once in a whole year to once every 3 days. The price varies. They're getting anywhere from $3 to over $400 per rental. Some of these are obviously multi-day or even multi-week rentals. Oh, so what am I going to share? I'm going to share a little bit right now with who are the car owners, what's their motivation for renting out their car to sometimes strangers, sometimes not, and then those two policy objectives. How might it affect their peak period travel, and how might it affect mobility for people without cars? That last question is the one I'm going to tackle first. And that question is it reaching underserved communities? So this is our map. What we've done, this is our first cut, just very quick, simple analysis at the early stages. So what we've overlaid here, we have 3 different models of car sharing in Portland. So we have Car2Go, and their service area covers a big chunk of the, I thought this was going to be a pointer.
Is the thing in the middle a pointer? No, sorry. This is the pointer. OK. Of course, I can't point to both sides at the same time. So the large hashed areas where the car-to-go cars can reside. But you never know. Well, you know if they move all over the place, right? So we don't know for sure where they are within that boundary. The X'd out areas are where there is a business to consumer. In our case, it's primarily Zipcar, where one of those cars resides. And the blue is where one of our peer-to-peer car sharing cars that is in our study, so it's not the entire sample, resides. And when you compare, and the boundaries there are census block groups. That was the quick way to do this analysis. So you can see, just looking at the map, that the peer-to-peer seems to be going out further to the east. And most of you probably don't know a whole lot about the demographics of Portland, but the lower income ethnic minority communities are more likely to be in the eastern part and somewhat in the northern part, though that area is gentrifying quite a bit. So when we look at the data, first of all, the peer-to-peer rates are range, at least of the cars in our study, anywhere from $3 to $50 an hour, depending on the car and what people think it's worth, averaging a little over $7 an hour. Compared to the business to consumer and the car-to-go rates, usually going to be lower than that. Our peer-to-peer vehicles in our study are covering 42% of the block groups in the city of Portland. So that's higher than the business-to-consumer model, but not as big as car-to-go. But again, you never know. You don't know exactly where those car-to-go vehicles are going to be. When you look at our data, 37% of the families in poverty are living in a block group that has one of the peer-to-peer vehicles that's in our study. So that's more than you find with the business-to-consumer car locations, not as big as, again, car-to-go. And similar sort of larger distribution or similar distribution for the non-white population. Okay, so getting into who's letting their car be rented. Some demographics. And so the yellow bars are our study, our car owners. The green bars is census data or ACS data, City of Portland. So they're a little more likely to be in a two-adult household than the population in general. They generally don't have kids, but at the same rate that the City of Portland residents don't have kids, a little over 75%. What I forgot to put on here was age, so I'll tell you those numbers. 59% of our car owners are under the age of 35. That compares to 36% of the adult population. So they are definitely younger. At least you could think of these as the early adopters, too, of the peer-to-peer car sharing. They are slightly more likely to be white. Portland is not a very diverse city, though becoming more diverse. They're far more likely to be college educated. And their income distribution is actually very similar to the City of Portland's. And so part of what this is telling me is, and it sort of confirms Portlandia in a way, we have a lot of college-educated baristas. So a lot of people with college education earning less than $35,000 a year, amongst other things. And then this is the thing that really surprised us, at least from the research perspective. Nearly 60% of our car owners only own one car, so they're renting out the only car in their household. So I would have expected a lot more. It's our second car, the extra car type model. And clearly there's some of that going on, but it's not a majority of what's going on, at least from these initial participants. So we asked them a lot of questions about their attitudes about mobility. And I'm just sharing with you a few of these findings. And I'm highlighting the things where we found a difference between the car owners. And in a totally separate research project, I did a random phone survey in the region where we asked a similar set of questions. So I was able to compare the two. And our car owners are definitely more multimodal. They are obviously not tied to their car. They're much more likely to prefer walking, biking, and taking transit. Those are the first ones, the first 3 bars sets on the left, and in particular, much more likely to prefer riding a bike over driving a car. They are less likely to say that they need a car to do many of the things I like to do, but still about 70% of them do agree that they need a car to do lots of things, but just not everything. And they're more likely to think that travel time is wasted time. So that's very consistent with this millennial idea that I'd rather be working on my smartphone than driving. And slightly, actually, less likely to say that the price of gasoline affects the choices that I make. We also see a lot of differences in how they currently travel, as you might expect, based on those attitudes. So this is commute mode compared to the city of Portland. Just over half of them do regularly drive to work, alone, I should say, to work. But 22% of them do regularly ride a bicycle to work. And that compares to about 7% of workers in the city of Portland. Transit use, very similar rates, a little more walking. So these are already somewhat multimodal people. So what are some of the reasons they joined they joined in the sense that they're renting their car out through peer-to-peer car sharing? Obviously, they like the idea of it. 84% they want to make a little extra money. So the financial motivation is definitely there. I don't drive my car very often, obviously, because they're riding their bikes everywhere. So it's a shame for it to sit unused. They like to try new things. They're comfortable with the insurance. And then some of them wanted to participate in the study was part of the motivation, so the research angle of it. So are they going to change their behavior? Because the whole idea, if this is going to reduce vehicle miles traveled, you might say, well, how would it do that? It's going to do that if I, as a car owner, leave my car sitting at home more often so that it might be rented out. And if the net renting out doesn't, result in more miles than what I'm avoiding by letting it sit there potentially to be rented. So we are, at least in the beginning, they're saying, yeah, most of them are saying, I'm going to change my behavior. They're saying they're going to bike more. They may drive the same amount, but shifting the time and the days. And so what we'll be looking at is, are they shifting out of the peak? They may walk more. Some of them may take transit more. Only 12% of them say that they're going to drive another vehicle more. Okay, so that doesn't seem to be a major problem. One thing we did is with that 6 weeks of GPS data, we divided them into high, medium, and low in terms of how much time they were spending driving during the peak period. And when we look at these 3 groups, what we are seeing actually, and this is a pleasant surprise if we're going to get the anticipated benefits, those people who are driving a lot, at least 30 minutes a day during the peak, 68% of them do plan on changing their travel habits to make their vehicle available to be rented more often. And 81% of them say that they're going to shift modes. That's a huge share and a surprising result. And some of them, about 43%, may also just shift when they drive. So what are based on all of this, some of our sort of preliminary conclusions, and I always have to have those cautions since this is preliminary. So who's renting out their car? They're definitely different from the general population. Younger, more highly educated, but no real differences so far, at least in terms of income and some other demographics. What's the impact? Well, we're starting to see some early indications that yes, perhaps it could reduce VMT, okay? At least what we can look at right now. Obviously, this is a 3-year study, so there's a lot more data that we need to collect that's going to complete the equation. The equity issue, some early indications that yes, it could reach a wider market. But still some questions, how much more? And again, I haven't even looked at the renter data yet to see if the renters are the demographic that the city of Portland at least is hoping to meet. My caution, again, this was just a subset. First of all, it's a subset of all get-around car owners, and it wasn't even quite all the ones that we have in our study yet. And we have a website that will in the future be posting more. There's not much up there now. So thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Elliott Martin.
So, hello, my name is Elliott Martin. I'm an assistant research engineer with TSRC at UC Berkeley, and the title of his talk is Evaluating Public Transit Modal Shift Dynamics in response to public bike sharing, evidence from 2 U.S. cities. And what I hope emerges from this, or what we're able to provide in this short talk, is sort of some simple, clear, and deep understanding as to what is the overall modal shift, what is the dynamics of modal shift that are occurring as a result of bike sharing, specifically in 2 cities that deployed very early, Washington, D.C. And Minneapolis. And so as part of the overview of this, research has shown that bike sharing has increased bicycling, and that's an expected result. And it also has reduced driving. And it reduces driving in sort of a very unequivocal way, in that no one increases their driving as a result of bike sharing. Everyone is reducing, between 25% of a sample population in Toronto to up to 50% of the sample population in Minneapolis are reducing their driving as a result of bike sharing. And that's a very, very positive result. Research has also shown that bike sharing in many areas reduces public transit as well. And so we want to take a deeper dive into this data to understand sort of what is the dynamics of this? How is that modal shift actually distributed? What are the attributes of people that are shifting towards transit and shifting away from transit? And it's interesting to note within this data that we've seen that not all cities experience a drop in public transit. Some of them show an increase, and why is that? And what are the characteristics of those cities that may exhibit more of an increase to public transit as a result of bike sharing, where other cities are showing sort of the opposite effect? And so, using data from the survey of that we did in 2011 with 4 bike sharing operators in 4 cities, we analyzed modal shift through mapping and through statistical analysis. So, oh, that was the pointer. Got it. So this is sort of the overview of the data that motivates this additional inquiry. This is data from the 4 cities, Montreal, Toronto, Twin Cities, Minneapolis, and Washington, D.C. And we collaborated with all 4 operators to conduct the survey to get this data. And a simple question that was asked of users, of members, was, as a result of my use of bike sharing, I use the bus. And then to answer the question in the form of much more, more, less, much less, or through a variety of responses, they could indicate that there was no change. And so, as you can see in the graphs of Montreal, Toronto, and also Washington, D.C., the majority of respondents, or say the larger share of respondents, are indicating that they are actually using the bus less. Some of the respondents in Montreal and also in Washington, D.C. are indicating that they're using the bus more as a result of bike sharing. So we want to understand sort of, well, what is it about those people that exhibits, what characteristics do they have that involve them using the bus more? And then there's the Twin Cities. And the Twin Cities is an interesting case. In this case, more people are using bus less than are using bus more, but it's more of an even split. It's about 14% to 17%. And when we look at the change in rail as a result of bike sharing, and the question in the same form, we see pretty much the same effect in the 3 largest cities. In Montreal, we see over roughly 50% of respondents reducing their use of rail in Toronto, and then also in Washington, D.C. These shares are relatively high versus those that are increasing their use of rail within these cities, and we want to know about them as well. And then we look at the Twin Cities in Minneapolis, and we see an interesting diversion from that trend. We see that, in fact, 15% indicated that they're using rail more, and only 3% are using rail less. So what's going on here? So some key questions. Where in the city are people shifting towards and away from public transit? And what are the attributes of those people that are making that shift in both directions? What do those people look like? And so to explore those questions, we begin by mapping modal shift as a result of bike sharing within these 2 U.S. cities. Now, the data that was collected as part of the survey was the location of home in the form of intersections, and then also the location of work. So we asked people, sort of, please give us 2 streets that intersect near your home, and then 2 streets that intersect near your work, as well as a city in which that intersection exists. It's a nice form of data because it preserves respondent anonymity, but it also provides a degree of precision to those numbers. And then we take that data and we geocode it. And in the process of geocoding those intersections, we can also pull out what is the commute distance, because it's home and work location, so we know the distance between the two. And we can also pick up the zip codes. And when we do all that, we can then summarize a lot of these points and what they look like in the form of sort of zip codes. And so that summary looks a bit like this in this graph. This is a plot of modal shift, or sort of a map of modal shift to and from bus in Washington, D.C. And I'll explain what the circles indicate. These are effectively the sort of pie charts of people shifting towards and away from transit. The yellow color is indicating is the share of people that have indicated no change. The red color is the share of people that have indicated they're moving away from transit, and the green is the share of people indicating that they're moving towards transit, bus in this case. There's a number in there. I know it's difficult to see, but that's the count of people that are in that actual pie chart. And so you can see with respect to bus that the majority of modal shift away from bus in Washington, D.C. is really occurring in the core downtown. That's where where most people that live that are shifting away from bus as a result of bike sharing. And then you can see also on the periphery of the cities where you can see these sort of splashes of green, where there actually is a relatively high share of people who are shifting towards bus as a result of bike sharing. And so it tells 2 stories. One, it tells a story that in the downtown core, people are shifting away from bus as a result of bike sharing, in part because bike sharing is faster and it provides them exercise. When we first did this survey, we didn't necessarily know that, but we're doing follow-up surveys, and that's sort of the preliminary insight from this, is that when we found that people moved away from bus, we asked them sort of why and what was your primary reason. And when people asked one reason, they could indicate that they were interested in getting more exercise. That's one response that has really emerged as sort of the primary reason. So it's a shift towards an active mode. But there's also the first mile, last mile story, and that is in fact happening in this data. It's happening on the urban periphery. And when we look at the modal shift and we map it in the same way with respect to rail, we see the same story. In the downtown urban core, there's a sort of this larger modal shift away from rail, and that's also where the majority of users are. No surprise, that's where the system started. This was 2011. And then on the edges, again, are larger shares of people who are actually shifting towards rail. And so again, it tells that the sort of first mile, last mile story that bike sharing is in fact doing in this large city, where people are using bike sharing to get to rail and use it more. And Minneapolis is an interesting story that shows sort of the same effects, but also different effects as well. And you can again see that first of all, the first thing that comes out is that there's more green. So more people are shifting towards bus as a result, and they're distributed quite well around the periphery of the city, but also they exist within the center of the city. And that the majority of the modal shift away from bus within Minneapolis is actually occurring in the downtown core. In terms of modal shift to and from rail, the story is even more different. And here you see very, very little red. You see mostly green. Mostly people are shifting towards rail. Now there's 2 rail lines in Minneapolis at the time of this survey. One was called the Hiawatha Line. It is now called the Blue Line. And then there's also the North Star Line, which is a commuter rail that kind of runs north. These 2 lines meet at, I believe it's Target Field Station. And it's basically one long rail line. And so that's an interesting dynamic about Minneapolis that's unique, because of course Washington's a web of train stations, is that the to and from access is much more predominant in a city that is somewhat of lower density and has sort of what is effectively a single rail line. The larger, there's sort of a more evenly distributed shift of mode shift towards rail. When we look at people who shifted and what do they look like, we do see that most people, the people who shift towards rail are predominantly male. So 65% of those that increased rail were men, and 34% of those that increased rail were women, versus a 54% to 45% split in the overall sample. And the same attribute emerges as being significant in Minneapolis, with a slightly tighter split. We did do some statistical analysis. That's just a plot, but we did do some statistical analysis also in the form of a form of regression analysis that was applied to this. And that allows us to sort of see, well, what attributes are simultaneously influencing sort of the modal shift when others are considered simultaneously. And so we see that age is one of the positive attributes, that the older the person is, the more likely that they will be shifting towards rail. Commute distance, so the longer the commute, the more likely they'll be shifting towards transit. This is actually just in transit in general. I mentioned the fact that gender is also significant. Household income is not as significant as you would expect it to be. It is slightly positive, mostly in the case of Washington, D.C. rail. And then home density, the population density of the home location, that is the home zip code, that is negative. And so those are the sort of core attributes of the user's location and also of their own demographics that sort of were found in the statistical analysis to drive modal shift towards public transit. And there's this hint from another city that we've been surveying this year that I'd like to share, and that's of Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City is a city that is smaller than Minneapolis, and like Minneapolis, it only has a handful of rail lines. It has the Trax light rail lines, and then it also has the front runner commuter rail lines, and these were recently opened. And the same question was asked of green bike users. As a result of green bike, I used Trax/front runner, and the distribution looks remarkably similar. And this is sort of the early hint that gives us a sense that there might be certain type of city or type of design of rail lines that when put within bike sharing, it really sort of engenders a lot of sort of the first mile, last mile access to transit, whereas in other cities, in larger cities, it's actually engendering sort of more direct, faster travel, lower cost, and getting exercise in the core downtown, where transit networks are highly congested. So it's sort of a bifurcated story, or however you want to describe it. But this is a hint from data that we've been collecting today that there's a city type that may have a certain type of effect related to transit. And so some key conclusions: modal shift from bike sharing is diverse within and across cities. And in large cities, shifts towards transit generally occur on the urban periphery, while shift away from transit generally occurs in the urban core. And cities with lower density and sparser rail networks may exhibit transit shifts that are different from larger cities as a result of bike sharing. And so with that, I do want to take just 1 second to acknowledge the Mineta Transportation Institute at San Jose State, which has funded a very, very large share of our work in bike sharing, which of course the California Department of Transportation, US DOT, and also the North American bike sharing operators that have worked with us on this. We actually couldn't do this without their collaboration, and it was a real pleasure working with Bixie, with Nice Ride Minnesota, and with Capital Bike Share on this data and on the generation of the survey. And then, of course, the survey respondents. So if any of you took these surveys as a result of your participation, thank you very much, because this data is, it's critical to this. I don't want to know who you are because it will violate CPHS regulations, but I do want to thank you because it is your time that allows us to generate this data. So thank you very much.
So Elliot didn't tell you that we worked pretty ferociously, particularly Elliot. We just submitted that to the Journal of Transport Geography. So we're pretty excited about it because we haven't done GIS before. So I went through data pretty quickly this morning so I could just focus on definitions. So I'm going to go a little bit more slowly. And I want to let my friends know that recently saw me speak in Toronto on car sharing. These are new data. So they may look similar, but they're updates. So we're going to start with a snapshot of benchmarking in the Americas. So due to my attendance in Toronto at the Car Sharing Association meeting, there was a meeting of the minds between Berkeley, Mexico, and Brazil. And they are now in our data set, and they came forward with buku data, and so they're now in the data set. So we're excited. Yes, indeed. So we're no longer just doing the North American data. We are now reporting on the Americas. I'm going to report some older study results to you on car sharing, because our classic car sharing work, because that's fairly well known, and that's as far as we have gone with the classic car sharing data. So I'm just going to review that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about 4 studies that we're currently doing on car sharing, and hopefully if there's another summit, we'll have some new data. So to start with, I know I went quickly through data this morning. I think the estimate of about 2.5 to about 2.8 million members worldwide in car sharing seems very accurate to me, or in the right range. In terms of being able to validate exactly where that is, give me another year. We do a census every 2 years. But you can see here for the Americas, which now include our friends in both Mexico and Brazil, we have a total of 46 operators, which I mentioned today. This excludes the personal vehicle sharing and peer-to-peer operators. That group is not able to be as forthcoming with the data, in part because of a lot of the investments that they have. And so at some point, we'd love to add them to the mix. These data do include one-way car sharing operations. And you can see the distribution, 24 operators in the US, 20 in Canada, 1 in Mexico, 1 in Brazil. You can see here, is the middle one the, what am I doing? Okay, there we go. Here we have the data that I reported today. In the Americas, we're at about 1.15 in terms of totals and aggregate. And you can see pretty much a continual growth curve. I report the data every 6 months, and these are the data for 2013. We've always reported the data as of July, because of this one artifact. We have this thing called the Transportation Research Board that we all write papers for. And this was how I started it, was I'll collect the data in July, and then I can write the paper in August. So that's why, if you ever wondered, why does she do it that way? That's the reason. So this takes us into distribution of the members, just a different way of showing it. I think the pie charts help a little bit with that. So Canada here, US here, Brazil and Mexico here. And now we're going into the vehicle data. You can see here that we've hit about 20,807 vehicles, and that was one of the quick numbers that I spewed out for you earlier this morning. And in the next slide, we've got the pie charts, and I think those are really helpful for showing the distributions of the number of vehicles. Now this one is kind of fun. My colleague Nelson Chan at the back of the room helped me with this one. We thought this was kind of a fun histogram to throw out at you. This is actually the growth rates. And you can see here that basically the US numbers coincide with the aggregate growth numbers around 2006. So you can see that's what growth is looking like. Member share by business model. I think what's really interesting here is, so we see July of 2012, we see July of 2013, and I just want to show you sort of what's happening here in the market, right? Is 76% of the market is what I call the indies or the independents, 17% the folks from Hertz, the folks from Enterprise, those types of folks, U-Haul. They were representing about 17%. And of course, they all have their own car sharing brands. And then we have the one-ways of the world, like our friends at Car2Go and BMW's Drive Now program. And you can see in July of 2013, there was a reduction. We actually had an acquisition of one of the car sharing programs, iGo, by CarShare Enterprise, so that's reflected there. And you see this big flip. Well, what happened? Do you guys remember what happened in January? Does anybody remember? Zipcar, Avis. So we converted the Zipcar data numbers inside our, oops, I'm sorry about that, our data numbers, and so now we're seeing an 80% representation of the rental car industry in this space. So I think this is a notable shift. We don't know exactly how this is going to play out. We do have our friends from Zipcar and from Enterprise Carshare with us, and they're going to be talking to us tomorrow. And so I think hopefully illuminating a lot of what we can expect to see or what they're thinking we might see. One way is up to 12%. Commune Auto entered into the mix during this time period, just for about 15 days. They launched in, I think, June of around mid-June, and the independents are now representing about 8%. So you can see here just a shifting in the market dynamics. You know, if I look into a crystal ball, I have some hypotheses, but we don't have enough time now to go through those things. And I think it would be far more interesting to hear actually from the operators themselves, which we will tomorrow. So vehicle share, similar type of dynamic occurs here. See July of 2012, see how the representation by business model shifts between 2012 and 2013. And you can see one way, this was a statistic I also rattled out this morning, 16% is representing one way. So a growth of 6 percentage points between 2012 and 2013. And this really big dynamic change with the acquisition of Zipcar in particular. Nonprofit and for-profit operations, I always think these data are a bit interesting to look at. So we've got our nonprofits, our co-ops, our transit, and our research projects representing a total of 24 organizations. So representing 52% of the operators, so the majority, but representing 3% of the total aggregate membership in the Americas and 5% of the vehicles. And in contrast, 48% of the operators on the for-profit side with an N of 22, and 97% of the members and 95% of the vehicles share. Now, moving away from member dynamics and market dynamics, this is a quick and dirty presentation because Elliot and I are splitting the time slot. And Elliot was still doing his doctoral work at the time we did this study, and he did a fantastic job leading the effort, and that's why you see his name at the front of this. So we conducted this survey in November of 2008. We had basically the majority of operators, which had never been done in the Americas before, on board. And we had a huge sample size, as you can see, and completion rate of the survey of about 80%. It was an online survey. Those are one of the easiest to deploy at this point in time, and it took about 10 to 15 minutes to complete. In terms of participating organizations, as I mentioned, at that time, really we had the majority of the market represented in this study. And in fact, Elliot, I remember we had a few other programs that participated, but the data that came in was too small, so we actually screened it out. So we would have had more operators if we had had a bigger N from a few of them. So really what I just want to tell you is some numbers that you've heard before, but that were actually documented by us in this study from North America. 9 to 13 vehicles were removed, including postponed purchases. 4 to 6 vehicles were actually sold as a result of each car sharing vehicle. Most of the shift, which was interesting to me and Elliot, I think at this point in time I was really convinced, yep, I got it, that we'd see more two-car households shifting down to one, and what we saw was most of the shifts were due to one-car households. Robert Cervero, our colleague at UC Berkeley, did a really famous series of studies with City Carshare back in the day, and he showed very similar dynamics. So these were still in effect around 2008, and so I think that's kind of fascinating to see, you know, how long car sharing has been really very tremendously affecting one-car households or zero-car households. But the second largest shift to follow came from the second-car households becoming one. Some really powerful data, I think, are that 25% of the members sold a vehicle or 25% postponed a purchase. So in aggregate, between vehicles sold and vehicles postponed, a collective of 50%. And the net CO2 reduction was approximately 27%, up to 43%. What we mean by observed is that with the observed number, we were really confident that those numbers were really coming from what was being reported in the surveys, because these people were selling cars and we were seeing a dramatic reduction in their vehicle miles traveled. With the full impact, we're actually asking people, if car sharing were removed from your choice set, what would you do? And that is where we get the greater reduction in the 43%. So that's essentially, you know, the postponed car purchase. So it can go as high as 43%. I will note just really quickly that that 43% is very similar to a number I saw reported in Europe many, many years ago at around 44% reduction in VMT. This is the study that's available through the Mineta Transportation Institute, who's been a great supporter of our research. It's available for free. And I just want to wrap up by telling you that we do actually have, gosh, I thought it was 4, we actually have 5 studies underway. We have a peer-to-peer car sharing study, so I'm delighted to hear about Jennifer's work, and it'll be really cool to see how our studies line up and compare. We actually have Savannah Share, Get Around, Relay Rides, Just Share It, all in this study. We're so super excited to have them on board, as well as Ego Car Share. So we hope to have those results, I believe, sometime in January. The survey is actually underway as we speak. We're doing a large value pricing pilot project study funded by FHWA and Ellen Greenberg, who can't be with us today because of the government situation. And that is going to be including our friends from Car2Go, we believe Drive Now, we think very likely the Auto Lead Bolloré group, and we're also in discussion with Commuter to join the study. Toyota has expressed interest with a few projects they have, and I'd love to get Scoot Networks into that, the electric bike sharing, because they're one way. We also have an electric bike sharing and car sharing study in conjunction with the feds, and City Car Share will be doing that evaluation. A suburban electric car sharing project with City Car Share, and also with Toyota Motor Company that we just launched in September. And one of the most exciting things that we're reporting on today, and I can tell you who the funder is, we're actually doing a risk and insurance analysis on car sharing, and it is funded by a group called Assurant. And they are here with us, and they allowed me today to tell you who they are. And they are not a traditional insurance company in the mobility sector, but they are a Fortune 500 issuer of special insurance products, and they are very aggressively entering into this market and space, along with many other insurance providers. And we're going to hear a lot more about this from Mr. Guy Fraker tomorrow in the breakout sessions in the afternoon. I always like to conclude with an acknowledgement to all of the organizations that support this research, the car sharing organizations themselves, the members, Mineta, Caltrans, USDOT, and many of our special partners at UC Berkeley. Thank you.
Do you want to take questions, Susan, or should we get going?
I don't know. So,
yeah.
So what do you guys think? Nancy's wondering. So you have drinks and appetizers waiting for you. And you have us.
So does anybody have a question that they want to pose, or you can come up and ask the panelists before you go get your drinks? Right?
It's been a long day, but does anybody have, why don't we take one burning question? How's that, Nancy?
Yeah, that's good.
Is that executive decision making?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Is there one burning question? Oh, there.
Okay. This is for Elliot. In one of your early slides, I'm right here, hi. In one of your early slides, you had 4 cities up and the effect on rail transit. And I'm wondering whether you tried to correlate to whether the rail systems in those cities carried private or public bikes, physically carried them on the cars.
You know, that's a good question, and no, I did not make that correlation. So no, I mean, I believe you can take the bicycles on Metro, and I believe you can also take them on Hiawatha Line, or that was the blue. I believe that both of them can take bicycles, but I'm not sure about the Minneapolis line, and so the short answer is actually no. DC, yes, you can. I'm sure of that.
In Minneapolis, yes, you can, but nobody ever does.
Okay.
So
There you go.
you'd end up with keeping it like longer than 30 minutes.
I would think that would be for a bike sharing bike. You know, that it would not make, I guess, economical sense to do that. You want to leave the bike somewhere close to the station and then get on there.
Get another one.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much to the panel for an excellent set of presentations.